I kept 2 husbands at the same time for 6 years without either of them knowing. This is the story of the most colossal mistake of my life. Greetings, dear friends. I'm Emma. I'm 85 years old, and today I feel compelled to share a story that has remained secret for a long time. Before I begin, I'd like to ask those of you watching this video to please like it, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments where you're watching from. This really encourages me to keep sharing my stories with you. Before I continue, let me clarify that I will use different names to protect the privacy of those involved, but every event I'm about to share is absolutely true. I never imagined I'd be here one day, exposing my deepest mistakes to people I don't even know. But life has taught me that our stories, even the most embarrassing ones, can serve as a warning to others. Today, I'll be 100% transparent about a period of my life I'm not proud of. This story doesn't paint me as an exemplary person, but I believe sharing my errors can prevent others from following the same path. It was 1960, and I was just 20 years old when I left my small town in rural Georgia. I was born and raised in Harmony Creek, a place so small that everyone knew everyone. My parents were simple folks. My father worked the land, and my mother took care of the house and her 7 children. I was the 3rd oldest and helped with everything I could from a very young age. Life was hard, but honest. Back then, girls from good families didn't venture out alone unless it was to get married. But I was always different from my sisters. I dreamed of a life beyond those mountains. I longed to see different places and to have my independence. When I turned 20, I convinced my parents to let me go to Atlanta to work as a sales clerk in a fabric store owned by a neighbor's cousin. It was the first time I'd traveled alone by bus. I remember it as if it were yesterday, sitting beside the window, my heart pounding, half from fear, half from excitement. I left behind my family, my childhood friends, and also Michael, my first boyfriend. We'd been together for almost 2 years, but I wanted more from life than just getting married and having kids immediately. Michael didn't understand my decision to leave. Our last date was a melancholic farewell, where he swore he'd wait for me. Atlanta intimidated me at first. So many people, so many cars, so many buildings. I, who had never seen a building taller than 2 stories, felt tiny in that gigantic city. I lived in a small room at the back of an old woman's house, Mrs. Beatrice, who rented rooms to girls from out of town. I worked 6 days a week at Golden Thread Fabrics in the Midtown neighborhood. The salary was modest, but it was enough to support myself and send some money back to my mother. It was at the store where I met David. He was a sales representative, selling imported fabrics to stores in Atlanta and neighboring cities. Tall, with dark brown hair and a charming smile, David would show up at the store once a month and always treated me kindly, bringing me new fabric samples to see before showing them to the manager. Little by little, our conversations grew longer, more personal. On one of his visits, David invited me for coffee after work. I accepted, even though I knew Mrs. Beatrice wouldn't approve. Decent girls didn't go out alone with men. But there was something about David that inspired trust in me. At the coffee shop, he told me about his travels, the cities he'd seen, how he dreamed of owning his own business someday. I told him about my hometown, about realizing my dream of independence. We began to meet whenever he was in Atlanta. 3 months later, to my great surprise, David asked me to marry him. Emma, I know we haven't known each other long, but I'm sure you're the woman for me. Will you marry me? I was speechless. Part of me wanted to say yes right then. David was honest, hardworking, and treated me like a princess. The other part hesitated. I had barely started my new life. Did I really want to get married already? I asked for time to think and talk to my parents. I sent a message to my mother, telling her about David. Her response was direct. Daughter, a good, honest man isn't found every day. If he respects you and you like him, don't miss this opportunity. 2 weeks later, when David returned to Atlanta, I gave him my answer. Yes. We got married in a simple ceremony in a small chapel near Mrs. Beatrice's house. None of my relatives could attend. The trip was too expensive. From David's family, only his younger brother and his wife came. Our start to life together was modest. We rented a small apartment in Decatur, a popular neighborhood. David continued to travel for work, spending 2 or 3 weeks a month away. I kept my job at the fabric store. The first months of marriage were wonderful. David was a good husband, kind, affectionate. He never mistreated me. When he was home, we made plans for the future, talking about having children and buying our own house someday. But soon, a routine set in. David's trip seemed longer and longer. I spent days and days alone in that apartment, knowing almost no one in the big city. I started to feel very lonely. My mother's letters brought me news of the family, how everyone missed me. In one of them, my mother commented that she was having some health problems. Nothing serious, she said, just things that come with age. But that worried me. When David returned from his trip, I asked him if I could visit my family. He agreed immediately. Of course, Emma. Go spend a few days with your mother. Family is important. And so, almost a year after leaving Harmony Creek, I went home. The small town seemed smaller than I remembered. My mother was thinner and had more gray hair. She cried when she saw me. My younger siblings barely recognized me. For 2 days, I was the center of attention in the house. Everyone wanted to know what life was like in Atlanta, what it was like to be married, if I was happy. On the 3rd day, I decided to take a walk through town, to see the places of my childhood again. It was in the main square, sitting on the same bench where we used to meet, that I encountered Michael again. He was thinner, his face more serious than I remembered. When he saw me, he froze, as if he'd seen a ghost. "Emma, is that you?" His voice trembled a little. "It's me, Michael. How are you?" What should have been a quick encounter between 2 old acquaintances turned into a long conversation. Michael told me he was still working at his father's workshop and that he had expanded the business. He told me about the town, the people we knew, the changes that had occurred since I left. He didn't mention any new girlfriend, and I noticed he wasn't wearing a wedding ring. When he asked about my life in Atlanta, I hesitated. For some reason I still don't quite understand, I didn't tell him I was married. I just told him I worked as a sales clerk, that I lived alone, that life was hard but I was managing. Perhaps it was the way he looked at me. He looked at me as if I were the same Emma from before, as if the years hadn't passed. Perhaps it was the loneliness consuming me in Atlanta. Perhaps a simple moment of weakness. Oh, a simple moment of weakness. Do you know that feeling, my friends? When loneliness is so complete that you'll grasp at any glimmer of the past, even if you know it will burn you? In Atlanta, I was a ghost, but Michael looked at me as if I was the whole world. That lie, as wicked as it was, slipped from my mouth as easily as a breath. That afternoon, we explored the town like in the old days. Every corner evoked a shared memory. Michael confided that he had never forgotten me, that he still kept the dried flower I had given him before I left. With the sun setting on the horizon, I announced with some sadness that I had to go home. Michael asked if we could see each other again before I returned to Atlanta. I accepted without hesitation, oblivious to the consequences. We saw each other 2 more times before my stay ended. On the last night, under the starry sky of rural Georgia, Michael took my hands and confessed that his love for me was still intact, that it had never faded. "Come back to me, Emma," he pleaded. "I know life here is modest compared to the big city, but I can make you happy." And there, in that instant, I made the first of many mistakes. Instead of being honest, of revealing that I was married and couldn't reciprocate his feelings, I let him kiss me. It was as if time had rewound, as if I had never left, as if David didn't exist. Upon returning to Atlanta, I carried with me not only the memories of my family, but also the unspoken promise to return to Harmony Creek soon. For weeks, I tried to ignore what had happened, striving to be a devoted wife to David. However, Michael's letters began to arrive, passionate, full of plans and hopes, and I would reply, "May God forgive me," confessing that I missed him too, that I thought of him, that I would return as soon as possible. Meanwhile, in David's presence, I pretended normalcy, pretending to be the same Emma as always. 2 months later, my grandmother's health deteriorated. I used that as a pretext to return to Harmony Creek. David, always attentive, not only agreed but insisted that I stay as long as necessary. "Family comes first, Emma. Stay with your grandmother until she gets better. I'll send you money. On that second visit to my hometown, the relationship with Michael intensified. We spent more and more time together. He took me to see the places where he worked, where familiar aromas filled the air. He introduced me to his friends as my girlfriend who's returned from the capital, and I, instead of correcting him, smiled and accepted the role. The situation began to complicate when, after a few weeks, Michael suggested we get engaged. It wasn't a formal marriage proposal. He was aware that I still had to resolve my life in Atlanta. However, he gave me a ring, a simple silver band with a green stone. "So you remember me and the promise we're making," he said as he placed it on my finger. I accepted the ring and promised him I would return for good as soon as I could. I invented an elaborate story about working for an influential family in Atlanta who wouldn't easily let me go, that I had to give a lot of notice, that I had to save a little more before I could return to stay. Upon returning to Atlanta after almost a month in Georgia, I carefully hid Michael's ring in a box at the back of the closet. I went back to wearing only my wedding ring. David greeted me affectionately, asking about my grandmother, about the family, and I lied about everything. That night, lying beside my husband, who slept soundly, I realized I had unleashed something dangerous. Lying beside David that night, his steady breathing was proof of a trust I was actively shattering. I felt like a traitor, a ghost in my own life. Every lie gave birth to another, and I knew I was starting a journey with no end, only an abyss waiting for me. The choice stood before me. Confess the truth to both men and face the devastation, or perpetuate the charade, dividing myself between two worlds. Driven by fear and selfishness, I chose the path of lies. Fear and selfishness. That is exactly what drove me. You see, when you're so deep in a lie, the thought of turning back becomes more frightening than the thought of just pushing forward. I had locked myself in a cage of my own making, and the tragedy was that, at the time, I truly believed it was the only way to survive. And so began my double life, a performance staged on two separate worlds. It wasn't just about managing calendars or hiding rings, it was about splitting my soul in two. In Atlanta, I was Emma Miller, the quiet, devoted wife. The moment I stepped off the bus in Harmony Creek, I had to bury her and resurrect Emma Carter, the girl who had never truly left. The exhaustion was more than physical, it was a spiritual decay. Some nights, lying next to David, his gentle breathing a testament to a trust I was shattering, I'd feel a wave of self-loathing so intense it was hard to breathe. I was a ghost in my own life. Then, in Harmony Creek, holding Michael's hand, feeling the genuine hope in his eyes, the guilt would shift into a different kind of poison. I was a thief, stealing his future with every smile, every shared dream. I became a prisoner of my own making, haunted by the constant, paralyzing fear of a single letter going to the wrong address, a single phone call being overheard, a single person from one life accidentally stumbling into the other. My laughter in one world was paid for with silent tears in the other. It was a slow, 6-year-long unraveling of the person I thought I was. In Harmony Creek, Michael began to finalize plans for our future. He bought a small piece of land on the outskirts of town and started building a house for us. "When you come back for good, we'll have our own place," he'd tell me, and I would smile, while inside, shame consumed me. In Atlanta, David was also making plans. He wanted to have children. He talked about buying a bigger house, of me leaving the store so I could dedicate myself to the family. And I would agree, uttering lies with every word. This unsustainable situation dragged on for almost 6 years of lies, clandestine trips, divided hearts. In 1966, an unforeseen event further aggravated the situation. Michael, tired of waiting for me to resolve my life in Atlanta, intensified the pressure for me to return for good. The house he was building for us was almost finished. His father had fallen ill, and he talked more and more about taking over the family business. "It's time for you to definitively come back, Emma. You've been on this shuttle for years. What's holding you back so much in Atlanta? Is it some guy? Just tell me straight." The direct question caught me completely off guard. I vehemently denied it, inventing more excuses about financial pending matters and responsibilities. Michael seemed to believe me, but I noticed a subtle change in him, a more distrustful look, more specific questions about my life in the capital. At the same time, in Atlanta, David began to question my increasingly frequent trips. "Emma, your family has been having problems for so long. Perhaps we should bring your mother to live with us here in Atlanta. She would have access to better hospitals." The suggestion terrified me. How would I explain that wasn't possible? I invented more excuses, saying my mother refused to leave the farm where she'd spent her whole life, that doctors had said the change could worsen her condition. David, always attentive, accepted my explanations, but I noticed in his eyes that something had changed. A seed of doubt had been planted. It was around that time that I started having recurring nightmares. I dreamed I was at a crossroads with David on one side and Michael on the other, both calling my name, both discovering the truth, both rejecting me with scorn. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, certain that I couldn't continue like this for much longer. In 1966, my sister fell gravely ill. It was no longer an excuse. It was the sad reality. Kidney failure, the doctors said. When I received the call from my nephew, I felt a mixture of genuine concern and guilty relief at having a legitimate reason to return home. David, as always, was understanding. Not only did he agree to my trip, but he offered to accompany me. "I've never met your family, Emma. It's time I meet your sister and your nephews." Panic seized me. "No, David, the house is too small. It's not in condition to receive visitors, and you have your work. You can't just cancel everything. Please take care of your business. I'll be fine." He hesitated, visibly hurt by my vehement refusal, but finally agreed. "All right, Emma, but promise me you'll call if you need anything. I can take the first flight at any time." I left for Harmony Creek with a heavy heart, not only because of my sister's illness, but because I knew my web of lies was becoming unsustainable. Something had to change, and soon. I arrived in Harmony Creek and went directly to the hospital where my sister was admitted. It was a modest building, more like a community health center than a real hospital. My sister was in a room with 2 other patients. She looked smaller and more fragile than ever, with tubes and a terrifying paleness. When I arrived, my family was already there. The youngest ran to hug me as soon as he saw me. The others were more reserved, but seemed relieved by my presence. Only my older brother, John, remained distant, with a look I couldn't interpret. I stayed by my sister's bed, holding her hand. She opened her eyes, recognized me, and tried to manage a smile. "Emma, you've come?" she said in a faint voice. "Yes, I'm here." At that moment, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see one of my brothers, but it was Michael. His face reflected genuine concern. "I heard your sister got worse. I came as soon as I could." Before I could answer, John interrupted. "Michael, take Emma to lunch. She's traveled all night. She needs some rest. We'll stay with her." Michael accompanied me to the hospital cafeteria. We sat at a secluded table, and he covered my hands with his. "I'm so sorry about your sister, Emma. I know how much you love her." I nodded, tears in my eyes, tears for my sister, yes, but also for that whole untenable situation I had gotten myself into. For an instant, I considered telling Michael everything, ending the charade, facing the consequences. However, the words caught in my throat. During the following days, I divided my time between the hospital and my family's house. Michael appeared every day, bringing food, offering help, talking to my brothers as if he were already part of the family, and in a way, to them, he was. Everyone in Harmony Creek saw us as a couple, just waiting for the right moment to make it official. The situation complicated even further when, on the 5th day of my stay, I received a telegram from David. "Arriving tomorrow. I got a few days off work. I want to be with you in these difficult times. Love, David." Panic flooded me. David was coming to Harmony Creek. How could I prevent him from meeting Michael? How could I explain to my family who this man was, who would introduce himself as my husband? How could I prevent my entire house of cards from collapsing at once? I spent the night awake, trying to find a solution. I thought about sending a telegram back, asking him not to come. I thought about meeting him at the bus station and taking him to another city before he met anyone from my family. I even thought about running away, disappearing before everything came to light. But deep down, I knew the moment of truth had arrived. 6 years of lies were about to exact their price. The price. All that night, my mind raced with mad plans. Run away? Disappear? Or face it? Every choice was a cliff's edge. I had built my house of cards, and I knew that the slightest breeze would bring it all tumbling down. That morning, I woke up before dawn. In reality, I had barely slept. The news that David was arriving in Harmony Creek left me in a state of total panic. I got up silently so as not to wake my sister, who was sleeping in the next room. In the kitchen, I made strong coffee and sat at the table where I had shared so many breakfasts with my family. I decided I had to find David at the train station before he could get to the family's house or the hospital. If I could intercept him, maybe I could convince him to go back to Atlanta, invent some story about my sister's sudden improvement, anything to buy time, and postpone the inevitable. The train from Atlanta would arrive at 10 o'clock. At 9:30 I left the house, telling my brother Mark that I was going to the hospital to visit my sister. I hurried to the station, an old, imposing building in the city center. I sat on a cold iron bench, my heart pounding so hard I feared others could hear it. When I finally saw the train arrive, that blue and white locomotive from the Georgia rail system, I felt a knot in my throat. It was the moment of truth. Passengers began to disembark. Families with children, hurried executives, some lost tourists. And then I saw David with his black leather briefcase, the same gray wool coat he wore on special occasions, looking around, searching for me. Our eyes met. He smiled, that kind smile that always calmed me, and I, may God forgive me, returned his smile as if I were genuinely happy to see him. "Emma, my love." He hugged me tight and kissed me on the forehead. "How's your sister? Any news?" "She's still the same. The doctors aren't very optimistic," I replied, my voice sounding hesitant. He took my hands in his. "That's why I came. You shouldn't go through this alone. We're together in joy and sorrow, remember?" Every word of affection was like a stab in the heart. There he was, a man who had traveled hundreds of miles to be by my side in a difficult moment, unaware that I had deceived him for years. "Let's grab some coffee before we go to the hospital," I suggested desperately, trying to buy time to think of a way out of that situation. We walked to a small cafe near the station. The whole way, my eyes scanned the streets, fearing I'd run into Michael or some acquaintance who might question the identity of the man beside me. David, oblivious to my nervousness, commented on the trip, on how charming the town was, on how eager he was to meet my family. At the cafe, I tried to convince him that there was no need to go to the hospital, that my sister was very weak and couldn't receive visitors, that it would be better to wait until the next day. He was surprised by my insistence. "Emma, what's going on? You seem tense. Is there something you're not telling me about your sister?" No, it's not that, it's just..." I ran out of words. How to explain it? How to tell him that the problem wasn't my sister, but the fact that there was another man who considered me his girlfriend. At that moment, as in a nightmare that materializes, I heard a familiar voice calling my name. "Emma, is that you?" I froze. It was Margaret, a childhood friend and neighbor of my family. I turned slowly, my heart about to stop. "Margaret, what a surprise. I came to pick up my cousin who arrived from Atlanta." Her curious eyes fixed on David. "And who is this gentleman?" Before I could answer, David stood up and extended his hand. "I'm David Miller, Emma's husband." I noticed the impact on Margaret's face. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened and closed without emitting any sound. I knew that expression. Well, someone who had just heard something so unexpected they didn't know how to react. "Husband?" she asked, visibly confused. "I thought you and Michael?" "Michael?" David turned to me. "Who's Michael?" The world began to spin. I felt the blood drain from my face, my knees weaken. It was as if all the lies I had told for years were taking shape around me, suffocating me. "He's just a friend from work," I managed to stammer. Margaret, realizing the gravity of the situation, muttered an apology and quickly walked away. But the damage was already done. I saw the confusion on David's face, the questions forming in his eyes. "Emma, what's going on here? Why was this woman so surprised to learn I'm your husband? And who is this Michael?" At that moment, I knew there was no escape. The truth I had buried under layers of lies was coming to light, impossible to contain. We walked in silence toward the hospital. With each step, I knew I was walking toward the end of everything. As we entered the hospital, my heart raced when I saw my cousin Daniel in the hallway. He saw me, then noticed David beside me. He frowned, clearly not understanding who this stranger was. "Daniel, this is a friend from Atlanta who came to support me," I said quickly, avoiding mentioning David's name or our marriage. My cousin extended his hand, wary. "Daniel Carter, Emma's cousin." David extended his hand. "David Miller." There was a pause, and then he added, "Emma's husband." I saw the shock on Daniel's face, the same expression I had seen on Margaret. But before he could say anything, a nurse approached. "Are you relatives of Mrs. Johnson? The doctor wants to speak with you." We followed the nurse to a small room where Dr. Campos awaited us. "Mrs. Johnson's condition worsened overnight," he said bluntly. "Her condition has deteriorated significantly, and there's nothing more we can do." The doctor's words fell like a stone upon us. Daniel asked them to call the other relatives who were in the cafeteria. I remained paralyzed, torn between the pain of possibly losing my sister and the panic of what was about to happen in my life. While we waited for the others to arrive, Daniel looked alternately at me and David, clearly trying to process the information he had just received. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he led me to a corner. "Emma, what's this story? Who is this man who claims to be your husband, and Michael?" Before I could answer, I heard familiar voices in the hallway. My other relatives were arriving, and with them, as in a nightmare materializing, was Michael. When Michael entered the room, his eyes immediately met mine. He smiled, that confident, loving smile he always had for me. He started walking towards me, but then he noticed David standing beside me. "Emma, who is he?" Michael asked, his tone laden with curiosity and slight apprehension. Before I could utter a single, useless lie, David, ever the gentleman, stepped forward. He looked from my panicked face to Michael's questioning one. "I don't believe we've met," he said, extending his hand. "I'm David Miller." Then, he delivered the 4 words that brought my world crashing down. "I'm Emma's husband." The words hung in the sterile hospital air, sharp and lethal. I watched the life drain from Michael's face. His smile faltered, replaced by a mask of utter bewilderment that quickly curdled into the deepest, most searing betrayal I have ever witnessed. His eyes locked onto mine, silently screaming a question. "Husband?" Michael's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible. He ignored David's outstretched hand. "Emma? What is he talking about?" He took a step toward me, his voice cracking. "We're building a house. We're engaged." The word engaged struck David like a physical blow. He flinched, his face paling to a sickly white. His head snapped back towards me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific understanding. "Engaged? What is he talking about?" His voice was no longer kind. It was fractured, sharp with disbelief. "Emma, we have been married for 6 years. 6 years." An oppressive silence filled the room, punctuated only by the insistent tick-tock of the wall clock. All eyes turned to me. My family, the doctor, the nurses, Michael, David, everyone awaiting the confession I couldn't utter. "Is it true?" David whispered, his voice broken by pain. "Are you involved with him?" Unable to meet his accusing gaze, I averted my eyes. That simple gesture sealed my fate. Chaos erupted like a devastating storm. Shouts, accusations, tears. David left the room amidst a torrent of fury and pain, knocking over a small table on his way. Michael remained motionless, as if a blow had paralyzed him. My family, divided between concern for my sister and consternation at the revelation, didn't know how to act. Finally, my mother, always the more pragmatic one, took control of the situation. "Let's focus on Emma's sister now. That other business can wait." But the damage was already irreparably done. When they were finally allowed into my sister's room, Michael refused to accompany me. He stayed in the hallway, sitting on a bench, his gaze lost, trying to assimilate the magnitude of the betrayal. I spent the next few minutes by my sister's bedside, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort that probably didn't reach her weakened mind. But my own mind was elsewhere, torn between the two men to whom I had inflicted so much pain, between the two lives I had destroyed with my lies. When I left the room, Michael had disappeared. A nurse handed me a note. "I can't look at you right now. I'm going home. Don't look for me." I returned to my family's house like an automaton, unable to process the avalanche of events. My parents barely spoke to me, their gazes laden with reproach and disappointment. In the small town, the news spread like wildfire. The Carter girl who had 2 relationships, the shameless one who deceived everyone, the woman who dishonored the family. I spent the night awake, longing for someone's return, the chance to explain myself, to beg for mercy. But no one appeared. At dawn, the dreaded news was confirmed. My sister had passed away during the night, without regaining consciousness, oblivious to the scandal caused by her sister, without the chance for a final farewell. The funeral was a martyrdom. I remained on the outskirts of the room, feeling the weight of disapproving glances. Not even in my last goodbye to my sister did I find comfort within the family. I was alone, isolated by an invisible barrier of shame and judgment. Michael didn't attend the funeral, nor did David. The 2 men who had been the pillars of my 2 distinct existences were now equally absent. I had destroyed everything. I had lost everything. After the burial, upon returning home, my Uncle Patrick called me to talk privately. His face reflected pain for the loss of my sister, but also a cold determination. "Emma, it's best you leave. There's no place for you here anymore. What you've done is unforgivable." His words, harsh but fair, resonated like a blow. I didn't respond, didn't argue. I knew he was right. I had sullied the family's honor in a moment of grief. Where will I go? I wondered, more to myself than to him. That's not my concern. Go back to Atlanta with your husband, if he still wants you, or go anywhere else, but don't stay here. That same afternoon, with a broken heart and a small suitcase with only essentials, I took the bus back to Atlanta. I left behind not only my sister's freshly closed grave, but also the fragments of all the relationships I had destroyed with my falsehoods. The journey was long and lonely, endless hours, gazing at the landscape through the bus window. Every mile took me further from Harmony Creek, but I couldn't escape myself, the guilt I carried, the remorse that consumed me. I arrived in Atlanta at night, took a taxi to my apartment, praying that David would be there, that he would give me a chance to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But upon arriving, I found the lock had been changed. My belongings were in boxes at the doorman's desk. The doorman, avoiding my gaze, handed me an envelope with some money and a laconic note. "This is all you'll get from me. Don't look for me anymore." There I was, at 26 years old, homeless, without family, without a husband, without a boyfriend. Everything I had built in my life, relationships, plans, promises, had collapsed due to my own fabrications. I spent that night in a cheap hotel near the bus station, sitting on the hard bed, staring at the peeling ceiling. I cried until my tears ran dry. I cried for my sister, who had passed away without my being able to say a proper goodbye. I cried for David and Michael, the 2 honest men whose hearts I had broken. I cried for my family, for the shame I had inflicted upon them all. And finally, I cried for myself, for the lost woman I had become. The next day, with swollen eyes and an exhausted soul, I went to the fabric store where I worked. Perhaps I could keep my job, start over somehow, find a new place to live. As soon as I entered the office, the looks from my colleagues already gave it away. The rumors had arrived before me. The manager, someone I had considered a friend, called me into her office. "Emma, I'm sorry, but we no longer need your services here." I didn't need to ask why. In less than a week, I had lost my sister, my 2 relationships, my reputation, and now my Jobel, because of my own poor decisions. I left the building with my purse on my shoulder and the weight of disappointment crushing me. I wandered aimlessly through the streets of Atlanta, one among thousands, but feeling like the loneliest person in the world. At that moment, I believed my life had come to an end. I saw no future, only remorse, shame, and regret. My dear friends, perhaps all of us have a moment like that, when we hit rock bottom, when you have nothing left to lose. And in that complete, soul-crushing emptiness, a strange thing happened. I wasn't afraid anymore. That's when I knew I had to start over from nothing, but this time, it had to be an honest nothing. On that afternoon in 1966, after being fired from the store where I worked, I found myself helpless on the streets of Atlanta. I only had the money David had put in the envelope, some clothes in a worn backpack, and the shame I carried like an invisible burden. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. I wandered aimlessly through the busy streets, observing the hurried people, each with their destiny, each with a defined purpose, except me. Night was approaching, and I needed to find a place to sleep. I ended up finding refuge in a hostel in a modest neighborhood, a simple place frequented by backpackers and struggling workers. "How long do you plan to stay?" the receptionist asked me. "I don't know, maybe a week until I get organized." I paid for 7 nights in advance and settled into a shared room at the end of the hallway. A bunk bed, a metal locker, and a broken mirror comprised all the furniture. From the dusty window, only the facade of the building opposite could be seen. Sitting on the edge of that makeshift bed, I began to analyze my situation. I had enough money to survive a few weeks, maybe a month if I saved as much as possible. After that, I would have to find another job. I couldn't go back to Harmony Creek. I couldn't ask David for help. I was alone, truly alone, for the first time in my life. The magnitude of my situation overwhelmed me completely. I cried for hours, muffling sobs into the pillow. When the tears finally ceased, a strange serenity enveloped me. There, in that unknown room, I made a promise to myself. Never again would I act on impulse. Never again would I let fear blind me. Never again would I hurt those who loved me. If I managed to rebuild my life, it would be on solid foundations of honesty and integrity. The next morning, I began my job search. Atlanta in 1966 was a growing city, with opportunities emerging. But for a young woman without strong references, without a clear social circle, doors closed one after another. Experience? I worked as a sales clerk at a fabric store. References? Unfortunately, I don't have any at the moment. And so, interviews ended. The week I had paid for at the hostel turned into 2, then 3. The money from David was nearly gone. The shared room began to feel like a cage, the broken mirror reflecting a stranger with hollow eyes. The city, once a symbol of my independence, now felt vast and hostile. I began skipping meals to save the few dollars I had left. The loneliness was a physical ache, a cold weight in my chest. I had hit the absolute bottom, a place of pure despair where I truly believed my story was over. It was in that darkness, when I had nothing left to lose, that I stopped seeing the world through the lens of my own needs and simply saw an old woman struggling with her groceries. Instinctively, I got up to help her. "Thank you very much, dear. These legs aren't what they used to be." Mrs. Clara, a lady in her late 70s, lived alone in an old house in a quiet neighborhood. During the short journey from the bus stop to her house, we chatted amicably. She told me about her children who lived in other cities, about how difficult it was to take care of the big house without help, and how much she missed having interesting conversations. When we arrived at her front door, she insisted I come in for tea. The house was charming, although it showed the passage of time, but it was impeccably clean and organized. Photographs in silver frames narrated a rich life: weddings, graduations, travels. "And you, dear, what do you do?" she asked me. I hesitated for an instant, feeling the temptation to invent a fantastic story. The old habit of deception almost prevailed, but I remembered the promise I had made to myself. "The truth, Mrs. Clara, I'm going through a very complicated time. I was fired from my job. I have no relatives in Atlanta. I'm almost out of resources and desperately looking for an opportunity." Her face expressed neither pity nor criticism, only a deep understanding characteristic of someone who has lived long enough. Do you know how to cook? Organize? Take care of a house? Yes, I learned everything from my mother. Then I have a proposal. I need someone to help me with the house and keep me company. I can't offer a high salary, but I offer you lodging and food, plus a small remuneration. What do you say? That's how I found my first safe haven after the storm that had devastated my existence. I moved into the guest room of Mrs. Clara's house the following week. The room was modest, but for me, it was like a sanctuary, a place to start anew. My routine with Mrs. Clara was simple. I woke up early, prepared breakfast, tidied the house, washed and ironed clothes, did the grocery shopping. In the afternoon, when everything was in order, we would sit together on the porch to have tea and chat. She shared stories of her long life, of how she met her husband, of how she raised her children in difficult times. I listened attentively, absorbing the wisdom of that woman who had faced losses and difficulties without losing her kindness. During the first few weeks, I spoke little of myself. The shame was still overwhelming. But Mrs. Clara had a special gift for asking questions delicately, for showing interest without being intrusive. Little by little, I began to open up. One afternoon, almost 3 months after moving there, I told her my entire story, omitting nothing, without trying to justify the unjustifiable. I expected to see in her eyes the same judgment, the same condemnation I had seen in the eyes of others. But what I found was something different. Not approval, of course, but an understanding that transcended judgment. You know, dear, we all make mistakes, some small, others grave. What defines us is not the mistakes we make, but what we do after them, how we get up, how we learn and evolve. Her words were a balm for my afflicted soul. They didn't absolve me of guilt, nothing could. But they offered me a perspective I hadn't considered. The possibility of redemption through future actions, not just repentance for the past. Months turned into years. My life with Mrs. Clara settled into a routine of mutual learning and growth. The modest amount I received as salary, I saved almost entirely. On Sundays, my only day off, I began to attend a small church nearby, not out of obligation but out of a true need to find spiritual peace. In 1968, almost 2 years after I started working for Mrs. Clara, she suffered a fall. It wasn't serious, but enough for her son, James, to come from another city to see her. He was a man in his 40s, divorced, with 2 teenage children. His concern for his mother was notable, as was his gratitude for my care. I don't know what she would do without you, Emma. I appreciate everything you do so much. During his week-long stay, James and I talked a lot. He told me about his work as an architect, about the difficulties of raising 2 children alone after the separation. Before leaving, James made a suggestion that would once again change the course of my life. Emma, you have potential for much more than just being a caregiver. Have you thought about studying, learning something new? The idea had never occurred to me. In my head, I was already condemned to a life of penance. Study? But how? I have no money or time. There are night courses. Mom told me you're intelligent and diligent. You could take a technical course, maybe something related to cooking, since you cook so well. The seed was planted. In the following weeks, with Mrs. Clara's constant support, I began to look for evening culinary arts courses. I found one at a local technical college not far from where we lived. The price was affordable, especially with the savings I had accumulated. Go ahead, dear, Mrs. Clara encouraged me. We'll reorganize our schedules. You take care of me during the day, and at night you go study. It's an investment in your future. And so, at 28 years old, I went back to studying. 3 nights a week, after preparing dinner and leaving Mrs. Clara comfortably settled, I would walk to the technical college to attend my culinary arts course. At first, I felt out of place among the younger students, but soon my dedication and the skills I had developed over the years made me stand out in the class. The course lasted a year. I learned advanced cooking techniques, baking, different types of cuisine. Every new skill acquired was a small achievement, a brick in the reconstruction of my self-esteem. I graduated with honors in 1969. By this time, I was 29 years old, having spent nearly 3 years rebuilding my life from the ground up. Mrs. Clara, despite her advanced age, insisted on attending the graduation ceremony. James came especially for the occasion, bringing his children. It was the first time in years that I felt part of something, that I experienced a genuine sense of accomplishment. "And now, what are your plans?" James asked me during the small celebration dinner I prepared. "I don't know very well. Maybe look for a job in a restaurant or bakery. Or maybe start your own business," he suggested. "Something small at first, perhaps making cakes and pastries to order. You could use the extra kitchen that's never used." Mom has already given her consent. That's how, at 29 years old, I started my small catering business. At first, I only made cakes and pastries for special occasions for the neighbors and Mrs. Clara's church friends. Little by little, the clientele grew, and I began to take on larger orders. In 1971, almost 5 years after the disaster that had destroyed my previous life, I felt that I was finally on the path to reconstruction. I was no longer just Mrs. Clara's companion, although I continued to care for her with the same dedication. I was also a baker, a woman with valued skills, with a small business growing. At that time, I began to think about the family I had left behind. The pain and remorse were still present, but not as intense as before. I wondered how my siblings were, if they still remembered me, if they would ever forgive me. One spring night, sitting at the small table in my makeshift kitchen office, I wrote my first letter home since I had left Harmony Creek in disgrace. It wasn't for my brother John, who had disowned me. I knew he would probably tear it up without reading it. It was for Sarah, my younger sister, who had always been the kindest. The letter was short. Where I was, what I was doing, how I was surviving modestly. I didn't try to justify my actions. I knew there was no justification. I only expressed my deep regret and asked how everyone was. 4 weeks passed without a reply. I came to the conclusion that, as expected, the wound was still too fresh, the resentment still too strong. I accepted that reality with a resignation I was learning to cultivate. Then, on a sunny morning, the mailman delivered an envelope addressed to me. I immediately recognized Sarah's handwriting. With trembling hands, I opened the letter. "Emma, we received your letter. It wasn't easy to decide whether to reply to you. What you did deeply hurt the whole family. Mom passed away last year, never overcoming the disappointment she felt about everything that happened. John and Mark still speak of you with anger. I also suffered a lot, but I can't hate you like them. Now I'm married. We have a small son. Life goes on. I don't know if our family will ever fully forgive you. Some wounds are too deep. But I wanted you to know that I still remember you, the good times we had before all this happened. Sarah." I read and reread that letter countless times. It was cold, distant, but it was something a half-open crack, a faint thread of connection with the family I had lost. I replied immediately, thanking her for writing, expressing my sincere regret. Sarah would send a birthday card once a year with a few brief sentences about how everyone was doing. It was little, very little, but it was the only link I had left with my past. Life continued its course. My small catering business prospered modestly. Mrs. Clara, now over 80, began to show more evident signs of age and needed increasingly constant care. James visited more frequently, concerned about his mother's health. In 1972, Mrs. Clara suffered a stroke. Fortunately, it wasn't serious, but it left her with some difficulties, trouble speaking and weakness on the right side of her body. The doctors were clear. She would need constant care. James thought about taking her to live with him, but she flatly refused. "My place is here in this house where I lived with your father, where I raised my children, and I have Emma to take care of me," she declared firmly. So I drastically reduced my catering work to dedicate myself completely to caring for Mrs. Clara. I didn't mind sacrificing my business. I owed her much more than I could ever repay. She had taken me in when everyone turned their backs on me. James, witnessing my tireless dedication, insisted on increasing my salary despite my protests. "You've given up your career to care for my mother full-time. It's fair that you're compensated appropriately." It was a period of deep introspection for me. Caring for someone so dependent made me reflect on the true nature of love, the selfish love I had pursued in my youth, but love as service, as sacrifice. What I didn't know at that moment is that life still held surprises for me, unexpected encounters, opportunities for redemption I could never imagine. In late 1973, Mrs. Clara's health began to deteriorate rapidly. Doctors spoke of advanced age and natural decline. I dedicated my days completely to her care, watching that extraordinary woman slowly weaken before my eyes. James came every 2 weeks and spent weekends with us. On one of those visits in March 1974, we had a conversation I will never forget. "Emma, I can't stop thanking you. I know it's not easy to care for someone at her age. She has been more than just an employee to my mother. She has been like a daughter, a true friend." "You don't have to thank me, James. I owe her everything." When I arrived here, I was completely lost. Mrs. Clara offered me more than a job. She gave me the opportunity to start over. James smiled, a kind smile inherited from his mother. "Still, I want you to know that when—" He hesitated, his voice breaking. "When the time comes, you won't be left helpless. This house has its value. When it sells, part of the money will be yours." "James, I can't accept it. I take care of your mother out of gratitude, out of sincere affection." "I know, Emma. That's precisely why I want to guarantee your future. Mom already arranged everything in her will. It was her idea, not mine." In May of that year, a surprise arrived by mail. A letter from Sarah, outside of the usual Christmas season. I opened the envelope with apprehension. "Dear Emma, I hope this letter finds you well. I'm writing to share great news. I'm pregnant with my second child. I know we've only had brief messages for a while. I think maybe it's time to change that. If you want, if you dare, I'd like to see you. Come visit me after the baby is born. I don't promise that the others will be ready to receive you, but I am. With love, Sarah." Upon finishing reading, I cried uncontrollably. It was the first time in 8 years that someone from my family invited me to return. I replied immediately, "Yes, I will visit you. Yes, I have the courage to face whatever comes. Yes, I really want to see your face and meet my nephew." But life had its own plans. In June, Mrs. Clara suffered a sudden heart attack. I spent days and nights by her bedside in the hospital, holding her hand, whispering words of comfort. James came immediately, and together we organized so she would never be alone. A week after her admission, in a silent early morning, Mrs. Clara peacefully passed away in her sleep. I was by her side, holding her hand. I felt the exact moment her breathing became lighter and ceased. There was no suffering, no struggle, only peace. The funeral was small, just as she would have wanted. Close friends, some neighbors, James and his family, and me. I grieved not only for the loss of my benefactress, but for the first person who had shown me the path to redemption through kindness. In the following weeks, James took care of all the legal procedures. Just as he had promised, Mrs. Clara, in her will, left a considerable amount to me, who illuminated her last years and cared for her with the dedication of a daughter. For the first time in many years, I found myself with some money, with real possibilities. I could invest in a real bakery, perhaps even hire help. But first, I had to fulfill a promise: visit my family. In October 1974, exactly 8 years after the day my life collapsed, I got on a bus bound for Georgia. This time, I was neither the ambitious young woman who had left, nor the disgraced woman who had fled, but someone who had traveled a difficult path of reflection and rebuilding. The journey seemed endless. Every mile brought me closer to Harmony Creek, and my heart raced with every curve in the road. What awaited me there? How would they receive me? When the bus finally stopped at the small station in Harmony Creek, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I got off with my suitcase and looked for Sarah, and there she was, with a boy of about 4 years old, clinging to her leg and carrying a baby in her arms. Our eyes met. She offered a shy, hesitant, but genuine smile, and in that instant, I knew that no matter how difficult the path ahead, there was hope. I walked slowly towards her. Each step seemed to last an eternity. When we finally stood face to face, there was a brief moment of silence. "Sarah?" My voice came out almost as a whisper. "Emma," she replied, adjusting the baby in her arms. It wasn't a hug, but a gesture of welcome. The little boy looked at me with curiosity. "Mommy, who is she?" "She's your Aunt Emma, sweetheart, who lives far away." "Aunt Emma!" Those simple words filled my heart with joy. I was an aunt. I had nephews I didn't even know. Sarah took me to her house, a simple but cozy home. Her husband, William, was at work, but he had been told about my visit. During the journey, we talked about simple things: the weather, the trip, the challenges of raising small children. Once home, after putting the children down for their nap, we finally had the conversation that really mattered. Sitting at the kitchen table, with steaming coffee cups between us, Sarah looked at me directly. "Why did you come, Emma?" "Because you invited me," I replied simply. "And because I needed to face the past. I needed to try to repair, even minimally, the mistakes I made." She nodded, thoughtful. "You know it won't be easy, right? John and Mark are still very hurt, and the town people here have long memories." "I know," I replied. "I don't expect everything to be resolved overnight. I just hoped to show that I had changed, that I had learned from my mistakes." Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. It was the first genuinely affectionate gesture between us since we met again. "I'm glad you came, Emma, really. I don't know how the others will react, but I needed to see you, know how you are." That night, lying in Sarah's small guest room, I reflected on the irony of life's paths. 8 years earlier, I had left that region in disgrace. Now I had returned, still carrying that weight, but also with hope for reconciliation. The following days were of gradual readjustment. William was surprisingly welcoming. My nephews quickly warmed up to their Aunt Emma from Atlanta, especially after I opened my suitcase of gifts. On the 4th day of my visit, Sarah suggested we go visit our parents' grave. "I think it's time, Emma. You didn't have the chance to say goodbye properly." We walked together to the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. Sarah guided me to a corner under a leafy tree. There, side by side, were our parents' headstones. I knelt before them, tears streaming freely down my face. "Forgive me," I murmured. "Forgive me for everything." Sarah placed her hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity. We remained there for a long time, each absorbed in her own memories and thoughts. Back home, Sarah made an announcement that took me by surprise. "John and Mark are coming for dinner tomorrow, along with their wives. I wanted to tell you about their visit in person." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was prepared for that confrontation, to see in my brother's eyes the judgment, the condemnation. "Do they know I'll be there?" I asked. My voice choked. "They know. I won't lie to you, Emma. They're not exactly thrilled, but they've agreed to come, and that's something." I spent the next day in a state of constant apprehension. I helped Sarah with the dinner preparations, making some of the family's favorite recipes, just as I had learned from our mother. When the doorbell rang at 7 p.m., my heart almost stopped. Sarah went to open it while I stayed in the kitchen, paralyzed by fear and expectation. I heard voices in the hallway, greetings, children's laughter, nervous conversation, and then silence. I took a deep breath, straightened the simple dress I had chosen with such care, and entered the living room. 4 pairs of eyes turned towards me. John, now with graying hair and deep lines around his eyes. Mark, stouter than I remembered, but with the same kind gaze, and their wives, women I barely knew. For an instant, no one said anything. The air was charged with tension. It was Mark who broke the silence. "You've changed, Emma." It wasn't a criticism, just an observation. And he was right. I was different, not only in appearance, but internally, transformed by years of remorse, rebuilding, and introspection. "It's true," I replied simply. "We all change, I suppose." Mark stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "I've missed you, little sister." And then, to my surprise, he enveloped me in a strong, sincere hug. That gesture was like breaking an internal dam, releasing 8 years of repressed tears. I cried on his shoulder like a child, unable to articulate a word. John remained distant, observing the scene with an undecipherable expression. The evening that followed was a mosaic of awkwardness and small breakthroughs. No one dared to mention the past directly, but gradually, the ice began to thaw. Only after everyone had left, while helping Sarah wash the dishes, did I finally ask, "He still can't forgive me, can he?" Sarah sighed. "John doesn't hate you, Emma. He just doesn't know how to deal with what happened. He suffered the most from everything, you know. As the eldest, he felt it was his responsibility to maintain the family's integrity. When everything came to light, he blamed himself for not having realized it sooner. The revelation hit me like a shock. I had never considered how my actions could have affected my older brother, how he might have felt responsible for something that was exclusively my fault. He'll need time," Sarah continued. "More time than the others. But the fact that he came today is something, don't you think?" Sarah was right. It was a beginning, however small. My visit, initially planned for a few days, extended to 3 weeks. Little by little, I reintegrated into family life, getting to know my nephews better and growing closer to my siblings one by one. Mark began to visit regularly for coffee. Only John maintained his distance, although his hostility was no longer so evident. It was during that extended stay that I made a decision that would change the course of my life again. I realized that I wanted to be closer to my family. The bonds that were slowly rebuilding were too valuable to maintain only with letters and occasional visits. "I'm thinking of moving back to Georgia," I confided to Sarah one quiet afternoon. "Not necessarily to Harmony Creek. I know that would be too difficult. But perhaps to a nearby town, close enough to visit frequently, large enough to start anew." Sarah was surprised but visibly pleased with the idea. "It would be wonderful to have you closer, Emma. And what would you do?" "I have some money saved. I could open a small bakery, or maybe teach cooking classes." The idea began to take shape. I used part of the money Mrs. Clara left me to buy a small house in a town an hour from Harmony Creek. It was a modest construction with 2 bedrooms, a living room with a fireplace, a large kitchen, and a perfect space to set up a small bakery. I moved in January 1975, marking the beginning of a new cycle. At 35 years old, I was finally ready to build something genuine and lasting. The first few months were about adapting. I had to build a clientele from scratch, doing small jobs at affordable prices. Little by little, the quality of my baked goods began to be recognized. I visited Sarah and her family every 2 weeks. I also met with Mark regularly. John remained distant, although Sarah told me he always asked about me. It was on one of those visits, almost a year after my return to Georgia, when Sarah surprised me with news that made my heart race. "Emma, I have to tell you something. I don't know if it's a good idea, but I feel you have the right to know," she said hesitantly. "Michael has returned to town." Michael, the name I had avoided even thinking for years, the man whose heart I had broken so cruelly. I felt a mixture of emotions: fear, shame, curiosity. He knows I live nearby? I think so. Harmony Creek is still a small town. News travels fast. He returned 3 months ago after years working in another state. He bought the old hardware store and is reopening the business. The prospect of running into Michael put me in a constant state of nervousness. I began to limit my visits and only went when Sarah assured me we would stay at home. However, fate has its own plans. In December 1975, during my nephew's Christmas party, what I so feared and secretly hoped for happened. I was in the kitchen helping serve when I heard that voice I knew so well, that populated so many memories. I froze, the tray of cookies trembling in my hands. "Emma." I turned slowly, and there he was, Michael, older, with subtle wrinkles around his eyes, but still with that familiar presence. Now, however, there wasn't warmth in his gaze, only a distant caution. "Michael, I didn't know you were coming." "Sarah invited me. We've been working together on some home repairs." His voice was controlled, neutral. "Sarah told me you moved back." "Yes, almost a year ago. An uncomfortable silence settled between us. There was so much to say, so much to explain, so much to apologize for, but words seemed inadequate. "I think we need to talk," he said finally. "Not here, not today, but at some point." It wasn't a request, it was a statement, a need we both felt. "Yes," I agreed, my voice almost a whisper, "we need to." A week later, I received a simple note. "Sunday, 2 p.m., City Park. If you dare, Michael." The following days were consumed by mental rehearsals, planning every word. On Sunday, as I walked to the park, I felt like I was walking toward my final judgment. He was already waiting for me, sitting on a bench under the shade of trees. He looked calm, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze lost in the children playing nearby. I approached hesitantly, my heart pounding. "Thanks for coming," he said, gesturing for me to sit down. We settled next to each other, maintaining a respectful distance. For a moment, silence hung between us, filled by the sounds of children playing and birds singing. "I never imagined we'd speak again," he finally broke the silence. "After that day, I swore I'd never see your face again." I lowered my eyes, accepting those harsh but fair words. "I understand, and I wouldn't blame you if you still felt the same." "For a long time I did," he sighed deeply. "Anger, pain, humiliation. I spent years feeding those feelings, letting them consume me. That's why I left Harmony Creek. I couldn't stand the pitying looks, the whispered comments. I'm so sorry, Michael. More than I can express." My voice broke with emotion. "What I did to you, to David, was unforgivable." He looked at me directly for the first time, his dark eyes searching my face. "Why, Emma? It's the only thing I've never understood. Why lie, deceive, create all that deception?" It was the same question I had asked myself countless times. The answer had never been simple, never clear, not even to me. At first, it was cowardice. I didn't have the courage to tell you I was married when we reconnected. Afterward, I don't know how to explain it. It was as if I were living two different lives, as if I were two different people. In some twisted way, I managed to compartmentalize, to separate, to lie to myself as much as I lied to both of you. He nodded slowly, not in agreement but in understanding. "And after everything came to light, what happened to you?" I then told him about my desperate flight to Atlanta, how I had lost everything. I told him about Mrs. Clara, the lady who had taken me in when I had nowhere to go, about my small bakery, about the slow return to family life. He listened attentively, without interrupting. At the end, he remained silent, processing every word. "And David? Did you hear anything about him?" I asked. He shook his head. "I never heard anything about him again. Years later, I wrote him a letter apologizing, but I don't know if he received it." Michael was quiet for a moment. "I did the same. I moved on. I moved to another state, worked, got married, had a daughter." The news hit me, although it shouldn't have surprised me. Of course he had rebuilt his life, found someone else, started a family. He deserved to be happy. "I'm happy for you, Michael, truly. The marriage didn't last," he continued after a pause. "After 5 years we divorced. She said I never fully committed, that I always kept a part of myself locked away. I think she was right. Another life affected by my actions, another consequence of my terrible choices. My daughter is with her mother. I see her on holidays and some weekends. It's difficult, but we do our best." We sat in silence as the sun began to set. The children who had been playing were gone, replaced by couples and elderly people enjoying the evening. "Why did you come back to Harmony Creek?" I asked at last. He shrugged. "Fatigue from city life, nostalgia for my origins, the desire to start over in a familiar place despite all the painful memories." "And you, why did you come back to Georgia?" "For the same reasons, I suppose. Family, mainly. I lost so much time, so many moments. I wanted to be close to my siblings, get to know my nephews, try to repair at least part of the damage I caused." "You know, Emma," he began, his gaze fixed on the horizon, "I spent years hating you. That anger was like a poison I willingly drank every day, hoping you would die from it. It shaped everything. It's why my own marriage failed. How could I give myself completely to someone else when a part of me was still trapped in the past, replaying that day in the hospital? He finally turned to me, his eyes clear. When I found out you were back, my first impulse was to run. But then I looked at my life, at the distance I felt even from my own daughter, and I realized the anger wasn't hurting you anymore. It was only hurting me. I needed this conversation not to absolve you, but to free myself. I have to let it go if I ever want to be whole again. Tears began to stream down my face. I didn't try to hide them. They were necessary, purifying tears. I'm not saying I forgive you completely, he continued. I don't know if I'll ever be able to. But I don't want to carry that weight anymore. I don't want what happened between us to continue defining who I am. Thank you for this conversation, Emma. He stood up, adjusting his shirt. I don't know if we'll see each other again. Harmony Creek is small, so it's likely. If so, we can greet each other cordially, like old acquaintances, nothing more. It was more than I deserved, more than I would have ever dared to hope for. Thank you, Michael, for this opportunity. I searched for the right words, knowing they didn't exist. I hope you find the peace and happiness you deserve. He nodded briefly and walked away slowly. I stayed there sitting for a long time, watching the sun set completely and the first stars appear in the sky. Forgiveness isn't always a declaration. Sometimes, it's just the quiet acceptance of letting a burden go. That conversation didn't erase my sins, but it freed both of us from the chains of the past. For the first time in nearly a decade, I felt like I could take a full, deep breath. I felt exhausted, and at the same time, strangely light, as if a knot I had carried for years was finally beginning to unravel. The conversation with Michael marked a turning point in my journey. It wasn't complete forgiveness. He himself made that clear. But it was an important step on the path to reconciliation, not only with him, but with myself. In the months and years that followed, I continued to build my life in Georgia. My small bakery prospered modestly. I began to give cooking classes to young people, finding unexpected satisfaction in sharing the knowledge I had acquired. My visits to Harmony Creek became more frequent and relaxed. I no longer avoided the town for fear of encountering ghosts from the past. Occasionally, I would cross paths with Michael on the street, and just as he had promised, we would greet each other politely, sometimes even exchanging a few words about the weather or news in town. The relationship with my siblings continued to evolve slowly. Sarah and Mark already treated me with the affection they had before, including me in family celebrations. John remained more reserved, but as the years passed, even he began to let his guard down. The most significant moment of this gradual reconciliation took place on Christmas 1978. For the first time in 12 years, all the surviving siblings would gather at John's house for dinner. Sarah insisted I go despite my misgivings. He himself suggested inviting you, Emma. It's a big step. Don't waste this opportunity, she insisted. I arrived at John's house with a pounding heart, carrying a homemade apple pie and small gifts for everyone. The table was set for 12 people, all the siblings, spouses, children. My place was marked with a small, handwritten card. Emma. During dinner, between conversations and laughter, John stood up to make a toast. Everyone fell silent. He rarely gave speeches. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. Family is our most precious asset, he began. His gaze swept around the table, pausing briefly on each face. When it reached mine, he didn't look away. Over the years, we've learned that family doesn't mean perfection. It means forgiveness, second chances. I toast to all of us, to those who are here, and to those who have passed on. As everyone raised their glasses, I saw tears in Sarah's eyes, in Mark's, even in John's, and I realized that I too had tears in my own eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief, of gratitude, of renewed belonging. After dinner, when everyone dispersed around the house, John called me into his study. It was a small room with bookshelves and an antique desk that had belonged to our father. Emma, he began, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. It took me a long time to understand that my anger wasn't directed only at you, but also at myself. As the older brother, I felt I had failed to protect the family. John, the fault was all mine. You couldn't have known. He shook his head. Perhaps, but I've carried that weight for a long time. I think it's time to leave that pain behind. Do you agree? That night, returning to my little house, I felt a serenity I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the disappearance of guilt or remorse; those shadows would always be part of me. But it was the beginning of something new: acceptance, forgiveness, the opportunity to rebuild family bonds. Years passed. I grew older. I watched my nephews and nieces grow up, form their own families, give me great-nephews and great-nieces. I became Aunt Emma to a new generation who knew little of my troubled past. I never remarried or got involved in another serious relationship. It was a conscious choice. I discovered other ways to love, other ways to connect with family, with friends, with the young students who frequented my cooking classes. In 1985, I received unexpected news. David had passed away. The information came through a newspaper obituary that a friend showed me. David Miller, 65 years old, engineer, passed away after a long illness, leaving behind his wife, 3 children, and 6 grandchildren. I cried for him, for the kind man I had loved and disappointed, who had rebuilt his life despite the pain I caused him. I sent flowers to the funeral anonymously, without a message. It was the least I could do, a final gesture of respect. As for Michael, we continued to meet occasionally in town over the years. With time, our formal greetings turned into brief conversations, then into friendlier interactions. We never mentioned the past again. It wasn't necessary. What needed to be said had been said that afternoon in the park. In 1985, when I turned 45, I decided to expand my business and opened a small restaurant in the town where I lived. The mathematics of my life were simple yet profound. Born in 1940, I had lived through 4.5 decades of joy, sorrow, mistakes, and redemption. It was modest but successful, serving home-style cooking that reminded people of their mothers' and grandmothers' meals. Today, at 85 years old, I look back and see a life marked by grave mistakes, by suffering caused, but also by lessons learned, by patient reconstruction, by hard-won redemption. If there's one thing I've learned, it's the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is knowing you did a bad thing. Shame is believing you are a bad thing. For years, I lived in shame, and it nearly destroyed me. The long road back taught me that while you can never erase the mistakes, you can choose to stop being defined by them. Redemption isn't a single moment of forgiveness. It's a lifetime of living amends. It was in the quiet care I gave to Mrs. Clara, in the pride of teaching a young student to bake her first loaf of bread, and in the hard-won peace around my family's dinner table. You don't outrun your past. You learn to carry it with grace, letting its weight remind you to walk with more kindness, more honesty, and more compassion. This has been my story. May it be a reminder that your worst chapters do not have to be your last. Thank you for listening to my story. May it serve as a lesson that even our worst mistakes don't have to define us forever.